Some stories just have this magnetic pull, you know, the kind that sticks with you.
Yeah.
And the tale of the Stardust is definitely one of those. Picture this. 1947, a plane vanishes over the Andes, completely without a trace.
Yeah.
Decades go by, more than 50 years, and it's like it just disappeared into thin air. The Stardust, a British South American Airways Lancastrian, simply gone.
It really is the quintessential aviation mystery, isn't it? Buenos Aires to Santiago, August 2nd, 1947.
Right.
A flight that should have been routine, but instead plunged into, well, decades of the unknown.
Exactly.
What continues to fascinate about the Stardust is precisely that long silence. For so many years, there were no answers, just an absence where the aircraft and its 11 souls should have been. This case perfectly illustrates how a vacuum of information naturally invites narratives, ranging from the logical to the fantastical, as we humans are wired to seek explanations even in the absence of evidence.
And that void, as you can imagine, fueled a whole spectrum of speculation.
You shared some really interesting material with me about this, particularly the Wikipedia deep dive into the Stardust accident.
Yeah, it's quite comprehensive.
What struck me is that this wasn't just a straightforward plane crash. This was a disappearance that ignited theories from the believable to the truly outlandish.
Oh, absolutely.
Our goal today is to really dig into all of that. What actually happened to the Stardust? What were some of those more imaginative theories? How did they finally locate the wreckage after all that time?
Right.
And of course, the detail that still intrigues so many. What could STENDEC possibly mean? The Stardust belonged to British South American Airways, or BSAA.
Exactly. We're going to meticulously go through the timeline, the challenging environment of the Andes, the crucial clues that eventually surfaced, and naturally, that incredibly persistent enigma of the final communication.
It's like a puzzle.
It is. It's like piecing together a complex puzzle where we've now found many of the pieces, but one very significant one remains stubbornly out of reach. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. August 2nd, 1947. The Stardust lifts off from Buenos Aires at 1:46 in the afternoon. Sounds like a pretty standard start to a journey.
Indeed. By all accounts, the initial phases of the flight proceeded without incident. The crew was experienced. The captain, Reginald Cook, was a decorated former Royal Air Force pilot.
Okay.
He was accompanied by a first officer, a second officer, a radio operator named Dennis Harmer, and a flight attendant. There were also 6 passengers on board,
6 passengers.
one of whom was a British diplomatic courier, which adds a little spice later on.
Ah, interesting.
Yep.
And then at 5:41 p.m., just a handful of minutes before their scheduled arrival in Santiago, the radio operator sends a routine Morse code message.
Yeah.
Expected arrival at 5:45 p.m.
Yep.
Seems like everything is on track, right?
Absolutely. That message suggested that the flight was progressing as planned, which is precisely what makes the subsequent silence so unsettling.
Yeah.
The Stardust never made it to Santiago. No further radio transmissions were received from the aircraft.
Bro.
And so began this extensive search effort involving Chilean and Argentine teams, with other BSAA pilots also joining in. But for decades, there was absolutely nothing.
Decades. Wow.
It highlights how the boundaries of our knowledge and the limitations of our tools can have devastating consequences, even for experienced professionals back then.
It's almost incomprehensible, isn't it? A complete vanishing act. It's not like a car breaking down. It's a whole airplane, 11 people, just gone.
Vanished.
I remember reading that there was a brief moment of hope early on with a report of a faint SOS signal.
Yes, an amateur radio operator claimed to have intercepted a weak SOS transmission. Understandably, this ignited hopes that perhaps some on board had survived.
Right, you cling to that.
Of course. However, despite numerous follow-up searches based on the reported signal, no trace of the Stardust or its occupants was ever found in those early years.
Nothing came of it?
No. And as the years stretched into decades with no sign, that's when the more unconventional theories really began to emerge.
Right. With no concrete evidence to explain the disappearance, speculation really took hold. And some of these theories are, shall we say, more imaginative than others.
Hey, yeah, that's one way to put it.
Sabotage was one, particularly given the later disappearances of 2 other BSAA aircraft.
Star Tiger and Star Ariel, yeah.
It created this narrative of some kind of systemic issue or malicious intent within the airline.
That's a natural human response, isn't it? When you have multiple unexplained events within the same context, it's tempting to look for a unifying explanation, even if solid evidence is lacking.
True.
The geopolitical climate of the early Cold War era, with its inherent suspicion and paranoia, likely also contributed to such theories gaining traction.
Then there was the theory surrounding the diplomatic documents. The idea that the Stardust might have been intentionally destroyed to eliminate sensitive information being carried by the king's messenger.
It certainly adds a layer of intrigue. The notion of state secrets and covert operations, very Cold War. However, as with the sabotage theory, there was never any verifiable evidence to support this. It was a narrative born from the mystery itself.
But my personal favorite, and I say that acknowledging its highly speculative nature, is the UFO theory.
Ah, yes, the UFOs.
The idea that the Stardust was somehow abducted or destroyed by an unidentified flying object. And this theory, the Wikipedia article notes, gained some traction, in part due to that unresolved Morse code message,
Which we'll definitely get back to.
which we'll delve into later.
Yes, the absence of a conventional explanation for the disappearance, coupled with that cryptic final transmission, created a void that more unconventional ideas rushed to fill. It highlights our innate human drive to seek explanations and meaning, even when faced with truly unknown factors.
But the decades of silence eventually ended, didn't they? Over 50 years later, the Andes finally began to yield some answers.
Finally.
In 1998, a group of Argentine mountaineers made a significant discovery on Mount Tupungato.
It must have been an astonishing discovery, high up on the Tupungato Glacier at an altitude of approximately 15,000 feet. Wow.
They found a Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engine, along with pieces of twisted metal and fragments of clothing.
The first real evidence.
This was the first tangible proof that the Stardust had indeed crashed in that remote and unforgiving region.
And that initial finding then spurred further expeditions, including one by the Argentine Army in the year 2000, which uncovered even more wreckage.
That's right.
They found a propeller and landing gear. Incredibly, one of the tires was still inflated. That detail really stood out to me as quite peculiar.
It is a fascinating detail, isn't it? And the fact that the wreckage was concentrated in a relatively small area was significant.
What did that tell them?
It strongly suggested a direct and sudden impact with the terrain, effectively ruling out the possibility of a mid-air explosion.
Okay, so not blown up midair.
Correct.
Yeah.
They also recovered human remains at the site, which, while tragic, was a crucial step in providing some closure for the families of those on board.
And thankfully, by 2002, DNA analysis had successfully identified 5 of the 8 British victims.
That must have brought a measure of peace, however bittersweet, after so many years of uncertainty.
Absolutely. You can only imagine the mix of relief and profound sadness that news must have brought to those families after so many years of not knowing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. While the discovery confirmed the tragic fate of the Stardust, it also provided concrete answers and paved the way for a more thorough understanding of the accident's cause.
Because the wreckage held clues.
Exactly. The condition of the recovered wreckage offered vital clues to investigators.
Like the propeller, which apparently showed evidence that the engine was operating at near cruising speed at the moment of impact.
Right.
And the fact that the landing gear was still in the retracted position. What does that tell us about what happened?
Precisely. The fact that the engine was running indicates that there wasn't a catastrophic mechanical failure that led to a loss of power.
Okay, so engines were working.
And the retracted landing gear strongly suggests that the pilots were not attempting an emergency landing. This points to a scenario where the aircraft was still under a degree of control when it collided with the mountain.
Controlled flight into terrain. CFIT.
That's the term. Which brings us to the critical role of the weather conditions.
Right.
The article mentions heavy cloud cover in the Andes region during the final part of the Stardust's flight.
Couldn't see anything.
Likely not. And then there's the jet stream, this high-altitude wind phenomenon that wasn't fully understood by pilots in 1947.
The jet stream. How does that fit in?
The jet stream is essentially a fast-flowing, high-altitude air current. In 1947, its behavior and impact on aircraft ground speed weren't fully understood by pilots, making navigation over long distances particularly challenging when facing a strong headwind from such a current.
So it could slow the plane down without them realizing how much.
Exactly. This is where the most probable explanation for the crash emerges. The prevailing theory is that the Stardust encountered a strong headwind from the west or southwest caused by the jet stream.
Cool.
This would have significantly reduced their actual speed over the ground without the crew necessarily being fully aware of the extent of the impact, especially if they were relying on less sophisticated navigational methods available at the time.
Right, no GPS back then.
Not even close. So it wasn't just a technical failure, but a confluence of limited technology and a then unknown force of nature. That really underscores the pioneering and often perilous nature of early air travel, doesn't it?
So they might have mistakenly believed they had already crossed the highest peaks of the Andes and begun their descent toward Santiago, when in reality they were still over the mountains, their view obscured by the heavy cloud cover.
That's the most logical reconstruction of events. Erroneously believing they were further west than their actual position, they initiated their descent into what they perceived as clear airspace, only to tragically fly directly into the cloud-shrouded slopes of Mount Tupungato.
Wow. It sounds like a devastating navigational error. But I also recall reading that some experienced BSAA pilots were somewhat skeptical of this explanation given Captain Cook's extensive flying experience.
It was some skepticism, yes.
They felt he would have been too cautious to descend without absolute certainty of your position relative to the mountains. And the inherent dangers of entering clouds over mountainous terrain due to potential turbulence and icing were also points of concern they raised.
True.
But wouldn't a pilot as experienced as Captain Cook have noticed a significant discrepancy in their airspeed or estimated time of arrival, even with the limitations of 1947 technology?
Those are certainly valid points, and experienced pilots would naturally exercise caution. However, the complete lack of visual reference due to the dense cloud cover would have made relying on dead reckoning estimating position based on speed, time, and direction particularly challenging.
So just flying by instruments and calculation.
Pretty much. And the unpredictable nature and poorly understood effects of the jet stream would have further compounded these difficulties, making it possible for even an experienced crew to misjudge their location. It's easy to underestimate how disorienting clouds can be.
It's a stark reminder of the inherent risks associated with early aviation and the technological limitations they faced. The article even draws a comparison to the 1972 Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crash.
The Alive story, yeah.
The tragic story depicted in the movie Alive. Both involved high-altitude impacts in the Andes, but with the crucial difference in the angle and force of impact that tragically determined the survivability of the Stardust occupants.
Precisely. The Stardust likely impacted a near-vertical snowfield high on the glacier.
Straight in.
Seems like it. This would have resulted in an instantaneous and catastrophic impact, likely triggering a massive avalanche that buried the wreckage almost immediately, effectively concealing it from the initial search efforts.
An avalanche burying it. That explains the decades of silence.
That's the theory. And then the process of the compressed snow turning into glacial ice. It's as if the mountain itself enveloped the aircraft, preserving it within the glacier.
Wow.
Only to slowly release fragments decades later as the ice mass shifted and melted.
Like a time capsule almost.
In a way, yes. The article mentions that only about 10% of the expected wreckage had emerged between 1998 and 2000.
Just 10%.
Yeah. That's an incredible testament to the power of nature to conceal.
It really is.
It is. And it provides a compelling explanation for why the discovery took so long. The glacier acted as a natural freezer, slowly revealing pieces of this tragic puzzle over time.
And more might still emerge.
The expectation is that more debris will likely continue to emerge as the glacier continues its slow movement and gradual melting.
It gives a whole new perspective to the idea of a crash site, doesn't it? Not a fixed, static location, but something dynamic and ever-changing, slowly yielding its secrets.
Absolutely.
The article also mentions that a 2000 investigation by the Argentine Air Force ultimately cleared Captain Cook and the crew of any negligence,
Which must have been important for the historical record and the families.
attributing the crash to the severe and unforeseen weather conditions that prevented them from accurately determining their position.
That seems to be the most evidence-based and logical conclusion we can draw. A combination of unexpectedly heavy cloud cover, the unappreciated impact of a strong jet stream on their ground speed, and the resulting navigational error led to the tragic controlled flight into terrain.
So the physical mystery of the Stardust's disappearance has largely been solved, albeit with a profoundly sad outcome.
Obviously solved, yes.
But then we come to the part that continues to ignite so much fascination and debate. That final Morse code transmission.
Yes. STENDEC.
E to Santiago, 17.45 HRS STENDEC.
That last word, STENDEC, repeated twice by the radio operator, Dennis Harmer.
Twice?
Yes, twice. It was received loud and clear by the radio operator at Santiago Airport, but the transmission was described as very fast, occurring just 4 minutes before the estimated arrival time.
Okay, loud, clear, fast, and nonsensical.
Exactly. And the meaning of STENDEC has never been definitively established. It remains the ultimate unanswered question in this already compelling story.
The article touches on the BBC Horizon program that explored the mystery, and the hundreds upon hundreds of suggestions they received from viewers attempting to decode STENDEC.
Oh, people love a good code to crack.
These range from it being an anagram of dissent to it being the initials of some obscure phrase. But apparently, none of those explanations really stood up to scrutiny.
The anagram descent is a recurring suggestion, but when you analyze it phonetically and in terms of the Morse code structure, it doesn't align particularly well.
Doesn't quite fit.
Not really. The theory of STENDEC being an acronym or initialism also seems quite improbable, given the complete lack of any context or prior use of such a phrase in aviation communication.
Right, it wasn't standard procedure or anything.
No. And while a Santiago radio operator did request clarification and heard STENDEC repeated, suggesting a simple mishearing of clear Morse code also seems unlikely given the repetition.
So he definitely heard something like STENDEC.
It seems so, but the article then presents what appears to be the most plausible and grounded explanation.
Okay.
And it comes down to the possibility of misheard or poorly spaced characters during that rapid Morse code transmission.
Oh, Morse code errors.
Exactly. In Morse code, the precise timing and spacing between the dots and dashes within a letter and the spacing between individual letters and words is absolutely crucial for accurate interpretation.
Right, the rhythm matters.
Critically. Interestingly, the sequence of dots and dashes that make up STENDEC is identical to that of SCTIAR.
SCTIAR, what's that?
SCTI is the 4-letter ICAO identifier for Los Rios Airport in Santiago, the destination.
Ah, the airport code.
And AR is the standard Morse code abbreviation for over, indicating the end of a transmission. Like saying over and out, but just over.
So the theory is that the rapid speed of the transmission might have caused the spaces between the letters of SCTI and AR to become blurred or indistinct,
Run together, yeah.
leading the receiving operator to interpret it as a single nonsensical word, STENDEC. That's actually a rather compelling explanation in its simplicity.
It is. It accounts for the fact that the transmission was received clearly, but as a meaningless word. The fast pace of the transmission likely increased the potential for misinterpreting those critical spaces.
Makes sense.
The article also points out the near similarity to VALP, which is the call sign for Valparaiso Airport, differing from STENDEC by just a single Morse code character.
So another possibility of a slight error.
Exactly. This further supports the idea of a minor transmission error having significant consequences for interpretation. A slip of the key, essentially.
So, while the physical mystery of the Stardust's disappearance has been largely resolved with the discovery of the wreckage, the linguistic puzzle of STENDEC might simply be a case of a rushed message and the inherent potential for ambiguity within Morse code communication.
That's the most logical and evidence-based explanation we currently have, although the definitive answer may, unfortunately, remain elusive forever.
We'll probably never know for sure.
Probably not. The human element in communication, particularly under pressure or with the limitations of technology at the time, can often lead to unforeseen and sometimes enduring mysteries.
So, just to bring it all together for you, the listener, a plane vanishes over the towering Andes, triggering decades of all sorts of theories.
From sabotage to UFOs.
Eventually, the wreckage is discovered, revealing a tragic accident most likely caused by a navigational error due to challenging weather conditions and the then poorly understood jet stream.
A controlled flight into terrain, sadly.
But that final enigmatic word, STENDEC, in the last Morse code message continues to fascinate, with a simple communication error now appearing to be the most likely explanation.
Despite all the advancements in aviation technology and our deeper understanding of atmospheric phenomena since 1947, the story of the Stardust endures as a powerful reminder of the inherent risks of flight in that earlier era and the enduring allure of the unknown. Even with the physical evidence recovered and a likely explanation for the crash, that final cryptic message leaves a lingering trace of mystery.
And that brings us to our final thought for you to consider. In our modern world of instant and often overwhelming digital communication, where we leave digital footprints with practically every interaction,
Yeah, everything's tracked now.
does the enduring mystery of STENDEC remind us that there will always be events and communications that defy complete and definitive explanation, leaving a space for speculation and wonder? Or, when we consider the very real possibility of a mundane explanation, like a simple Morse code communication error, does that hold a deeper lesson for us about the inherent fragility of information and the potential for significant consequences to arise from even seemingly minor slips or misunderstandings in communication?
It's a great question. Is the mystery more compelling than the likely, rather simple explanation?
It's something to really think about long after our deep dive into the Stardust concludes. Which explanation resonates most with you, and maybe why?